to not quite adapt something from Monty Python, not quite a now for something completely different, more like I feel like doing something a bit different. While I roll the credits, you'll see what I'm on about. There we go, perfect. Now, what we can see here, inspired by Slapshoes on his video about 9 types of NASCAR winner, we see here a similarly orientated graph, or table, I suppose you call it, whatever. But this time, what I thought I'd do is do one associated with what I think of as the 9 types of F1 winners. So the only criteria in this, obviously, is as long as the people being entered here have won at least once, that's fine. As long, it doesn't matter whether they've won 1 championship, none, or 7. As long as they have won at least 1 Grand Prix, that's all that counts. And I thought I'd start with this one. Lawful good. And in order to satisfy this one, what I thought I'd do is look to my favourite Formula One driver of all time. By far one of the most naturally gifted of his generation, and probably one of the most humble drivers ever to have graced Formula One. And best of all, he was squeaky clean. He didn't break any rules at all. Not consciously anyway. I'm talking about Scottish Borders farmer Jim Clark. Now, as I said in a previous video, Jimmy Clark was not the sort of driver who craved fame and fortune. His ego was practically zero, non-existent. Instead, what he loved more than anything, almost, was driving cars fast. That was all. All the trimmings that came with it he had no interest in. All he was interested in outside of racing was tending to his farm in the Scottish Borders. How much more humble can you get than that? Because it meant that he was not distracted by, oh, the press will be there, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to do this. He was just focused on the business of racing, as in driving as fast as he could. Not by overly aggressively driving. He was silky smooth. If you ever look up Jim Clark's driving style, he used to say, I don't drive any harder, I just concentrate harder, which makes me go faster. So that was an easy one. The rest of them shouldn't be so easy. What I thought I'd do next was this. Chaotic good. Now, chaotic good drivers, they're not people who break the rules necessarily, but most of the time they're obscure and stuff like that, but when they do show up, wow, they really do show up. And for a while I considered drivers like Gerhard Berger, only 10 race victories, was never really a contender for the World Championship because he was, amongst others, teammates to Ayrton Senna. More on him in a bit. But then I hit upon it. The truest example of chaotic good, Venezuela's own Pastor Maldonado. Now, Pastor Maldonado, he's really underrated, I think, because he really did put his heart into racing as such. But most of the time he could have a reputation for trying too hard, which is probably why he's known on internet memes as Crashter Maldonado. But they do forget one Grand Prix. The 2012 Spanish Grand Prix. He inherited pole position when Lewis Hamilton was excluded for having his car having not enough fuel in the tank after qualifying to take a fuel sample, and also not being able to make it back to the pits under his own power. But nonetheless, Maldonado started from pole position in Spain in 2012. Nobody expected him to stand a chance. I mean, the driver alongside him was Fernando Alonso. But despite losing the lead on that first lap, Maldonado didn't give up. He pushed all the way through the race, but at the same time sticking to that balance of pushing hard but not too hard to thermally degrade the tyres, which the 2012 era Pirelli tyres were susceptible to. So by pitting for his second stint a few laps earlier than ideal, he was able to leapfrog the double world champion and held on to a very, very popular first, and it would turn out, only race victory in Formula One. So the next one I thought I'd go for was the edgier side of the chaos side of the graph. And for chaotic evil, for a while I thought Michael Schumacher, because he was involved in infamous moments like Adelaide 1994 or Jerez 1997 or Monaco 2006. But then I changed my mind, because not even Michael Schumacher was capable of using his car like a missile. But with that in mind, I thought we'll stick with my changed mind. So as chaotic evil, we have Brazil's own 3 times world champion in 1988, 1990 and 91, Ayrton Senna da Silva. Make no mistake, Ayrton Senna was one of the most naturally gifted drivers ever to grace the world of Formula One. His driving in races like Estoril 1985 or Donington 1993 have gone down in legend. But Ayrton Senna was also known for other things, like ramming Alain Prost out of the race in Japan 1990. But even when they weren't Alain Prost, Senna had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. He would give no inch when either defending or attacking. He would dive bomb people from seemingly impossibly far back, and he would force the driver he was overtaking to leave it up to them to decide how badly they wanted to finish a race or not. And similar to one of NASCAR's greatest drivers, Dale Earnhardt, who Senna was intimidating. He would use the combination of his bright yellow helmet with, for the most successful part of his career anyway, the Dayglow red and white McLaren, to particularly when he was on qualifying laps, he would come rocketing behind them and they would jump out of the way, because everybody wanted to see a Senna pole position lap, and they didn't want people ruining it, because it was what people wanted to see, a Senna pole position. But again, like Dale Earnhardt, he was a man of an enormous heart as well. He was capable of amazing acts of kindness and selflessness. When Eric Comas crashed in practice for the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix, Senna stopped his car by the side of the track, got out, ran across what was still a live track the session hadn't been red flagged at that point, ran to Comas's car and turned the engine off because Comas's foot was still on the gas and the engine was still revving quite hard, and stabilised Comas's neck before marshals and paramedics came over to save Comas's life. So that's why I regard Senna as chaotic evil. Not because of how iron-hearted he was, because like I just said, he wasn't. It was more how there was never a dull moment, but he was capable of really questionable things. And that's probably why, when he had his very famous, or infamous, depending on how you want to put it, rivalry with Alain Prost, more on him very soon, that's what got fans captivated one way or the other. You were either a Senna loyalist or you were a fervent anti-Senna. There was very little middle ground between those two legends of the sport. Now, I mentioned Alain Prost just then, and I think that to some degree it could be argued that he falls into this category: Lawful Evil. Let me explain. Before Michael Schumacher came along and beat his record at the Belgian Grand Prix in 2001, Alain Prost was statistically the most successful driver in Formula One. But he didn't go about it by going as fast as he could all the time, because, to coin a phrase Jackie Stewart used to say, the best way to win a race is to win it as slowly as possible. Which sounds a bit strange, but in a way it makes sense. Because the idea is not to break your car before you get there. Because, to use another phrase, to finish first you have to finish. And Prost did this more often than not. He would deliberately hang back in races to conserve fuel, knowing that his rivals would run out before him. But there was also another side to Alain Prost. I can't verify it because it's only one person's word against another, but there have been stories that Alain Prost, when teammates were faster than him, like Nigel Mansell, he would want to know how he was going that fast and look at his setup as such, but he would not allow the reverse. He would not allow Mansell to see his own setup. And also, in one Grand Prix, Prost persuaded his team to swap chassis with Mansell because Prost had made a mess out of setting up his car and Mansell had got it right. And Mansell only found this out after the race, where Prost won and Mansell didn't. And then of course we get to Suzuka 1989. It's not for me to say whether Prost did it deliberately or not, but what is for sure, I'll demonstrate by going this way. This is Prost, right? This is Senna, and they're going into the Casino Triangle hairpin, or chicane rather, at Suzuka. Prost turned in way before the apex. If Senna wasn't there, he was going to cut the chicane. But instead, they collided. Prost collided knowing that in the event of them both colliding, they would both be out of the race and Prost would be world champion there and then. Was it right? There was nothing in the rules that said Prost couldn't do that, but at the same time it still sparked debate, and even today there are people who debate the ethics of it. I'm not the one to say it, but anyway, that's what makes and Prost, as far as I'm concerned, Lawful Evil. So that's the four corners, as I like to think of them, done and dusted. Lawful good, chaotic evil, and lawful evil. But now I would like to look at this one, Lawful Neutral. Now for this one, I thought a driver who wouldn't go out of his way to break the rules, but at the same time some of the things were a little bit questionable, but not to the same extent as some, let's say. So to this end, I thought I would introduce for this one Austria's greatest ever racing driver. World champion in 1975, 1977 and 1984, Niki Lauda. Now, in order to show what I meant about Niki Lauda being a lawful neutral, let's look at the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix. It wasn't anything that Lauda did right or wrong one way or the other. However, the car he drove, the Brabham BT46B, also known as the Brabham fan car, while it met the letter of the regulations, it's debatable whether it met the spirit of the regulations. Because the designer of that car, Gordon Murray, he took the idea from the regulations. Specifically, like many designers, he looked at the regulations once to see how the rules say what's not allowed, and then he read them again to look for gaps in the wording. And in this particular case, the wording stipulated, quote, "Any device that's movable in an aerodynamic context that influences the performance of the car is illegal." So what does Gordon Murray do? He puts a fan on the back of the gearbox of the car, which is driven off that gearbox, to argue that it's primarily to cool the engine, but it has the side effect of sucking air out from the floor, thus increasing the downforce. And how successful was the car? Well, in my view, it's the most statistically successful car of all time. One entry, one victory, 100% success rate. And the only reason it didn't get pole position was because the team owner of Brabham at the time, a certain Bernard Eccleston, tried to throw his opposition off the scent by making the cars qualify on full tanks, because he didn't want them to appear too fast, in other words. But in the race, they couldn't hide it any longer, and Brabham, in the hands of Lauda, won the race by, I don't know, 34 seconds. And for 70s Formula One, that is a country mile. Nothing in the law at the time that said that they couldn't do it, but true to lawful neutral, Lauda just got on with it and won the race. Sticking with the neutral side, let's look at the chaotic side of neutrality. People who have won races in an unusual way. So we could say Olivier Panis, for example, started 14th on the grid at Monaco in 1996 and came out as the race winner. Or, and this is where my candidate comes in, Peter Revson, winner of the 1973 Canadian Grand Prix. Now, as Slapshoes said in his video about the 9 types of NASCAR winner, he mentioned about scoring errors, which fortunately with electronic timing doesn't happen anymore. There was at least one example in Formula One, and that's where Peter Revson's 1973 Canadian Grand Prix victory comes in. Because that race was the very first time a safety or pace car came into a race to neutralise proceedings to enable a crash to be dealt with in relative safety. However, nobody could agree on who was actually leading. So when the safety car was deployed, they picked up Howden Ganley. Howden Ganley was definitely not leading, but nobody in the pit lane could agree who was actually leading, because the organisers had lost control of the official lap times. In the end, the organisers consulted all the teams as to who was where on the racetrack. Weird. So in the end, after consultation, they decided that it was Peter Revson first, reigning world champion Emerson Fittipaldi second, and Jackie Oliver third. But who knows? Since they were originally going to give the win to Ganley. Moving on, now we move on to True Neutral. This was a tough one for me because it's very difficult to find neutrality in a Formula One race winner, because they always arise passion and debate one way or the other. But in terms of how they drove, tricky one. Because on the one hand you could say Jenson Button, because he never did anything one way or the other to annoy anybody, and yet still drove well enough to win the World Championship in 2009. But then again, the car he drove, while it met the letter of the regulations, it didn't meet the spirit of the regulations. I'm talking, of course, about the double diffuser. So, as a bit of a stab in the dark, I thought I'd put the 2004 Monaco Grand Prix race winner, Jarno Trulli. Now, if you think of the name Jarno Trulli, for the most part, he would probably be, oh, he's at the head of a long train of cars because he put the car up higher than it should have been, and he's going to drop down the field when they undercut him. But on that day in 2004, he did, in an undramatic fashion, he was playing faster than everybody else, on average anyway. Trulli put the car on pole position and took his one and only race victory. And yet, despite that, it wasn't enough for him to retain his drive at the Renault team. Such is life, I suppose. Now, I mentioned Jenson Button a short time ago, and I thought he can fit in here. He's not the sort of person who would do things that are negative necessarily. And yes, one of his victories was, no two ways about it, chaotic, Canada 2011. But for the most part, I would put him in neutral good, in the sense that nobody had any bad words to say about him. He was a safe pair of hands, and like I said, good enough to become world champion in 2009. Like Jim Clark, who I mentioned earlier, Jenson Button's driving style is, for the most part, undramatic. He takes the ideal line into the corner. He's not overly aggressive with the controls of the car, but it certainly worked to good effect for him. I mean, like I said, winning the World Championship in 2009. Even if it did take him 113 attempts before he finally secured a race victory in Hungary 2006. But nonetheless, when he did finally become world champion, there was almost universal approval, even if people were a bit at first sceptical about the legality of his brawn. But, all being as it is, certainly a neutral good candidate in my eyes. And also, side note, he shares my birthday. He's 9 years to the day older than me. We both have the 19th of January as our birthday. And last but not least, we have what I think of as quite possibly the toughest subject to cover, or toughest criteria to cover, for the 9 types of F1 winner. Neutral evil. It's very difficult to find neutrality in questionable acts, but they do exist, and after some thought, I thought I'd give it to another Brazilian, another 3 times world champion, but this time I thought, who else picked a fight with a backmarker after being taken out of Hockenheim in 1982? Nelson Piquet Sr. In case you're not aware, the backmarker incident I was talking about was when, while dominating the German Grand Prix in 1982, Nelson Piquet collided with the Chilean driver Eliseo Salazar at the far end of the old Hockenheim circuit at the Ostkurve. And to say Piquet was unimpressed would be a bit of a mastery of understatement. So rather than saying, "Oh, what the hell are you doing? Why did you crash into me when I was trying to lap you?" Piquet instead broke fisticuffs out and hit Salazar, who was probably a bit conciliatory, I think the right word is. But even taking that incident aside, Piquet did have his questionable moments. Like in his early days, in the early 1980s, although the governing body at the time, FISA, Fédération Internationale du Sport de l'Automobile, the current FIA, if you will, although they were trying their best to ban side skirts for ground effect cars, Brabham, again it goes back to Brabham, had come up with an ingenious way of satisfying the regulations. When the car was stationary, the skirts would be the minimum height above the track. But while the car was running, the skirts would be lowered, increasing the amount of low pressure area under the car. Because the lower the pressure under the car, the faster the airflow is under the car, and hence the increased downforce. But there was also the situation that he had with Nigel Mansell at Williams. Because Piquet would allegedly, I'm not in a position again to say that this is definite, because I'm only going by what I've heard. Piquet allegedly would get up to all sorts of tricks to put Mansell off his guard, all because Piquet allegedly was unhappy with the fact that Mansell was employed as his number 2 driver and Piquet was hired to clean up and win the World Championship, which Piquet did in the end, eventually, by default in 1987 with Williams, after Mansell injured his back at the S-curves in Suzuka. But yeah, neutral evil. There you have it. 9 types of F1 winner. You may agree or disagree, these are just my opinions. But I'll leave it there, guys, and yeah, I'll see you soon.